Okay, go ahead and get started. Some folks are trickling in, the top of the hour, 6 Central, 7 Eastern time. So thanks everyone for coming. Our ACM meetup for this evening is the Non-Protoplasmic Sentience Driving DABUS with Dr. Stephen Thaler, a joint meeting between ACM DC and ACM Chicago. So special thanks to the ACM local organizers for their help with tonight's event. I'm Terry Grossheim, located in the DC area. On the meeting with me, I have both Mark Temkin and Dr. Alvin Chin with ACM Chicago. And Andrew, who is not here, is also in the same organization I'm with in DC. And then we also have the IEEE Computer Society of Chicago participating. And of course, on our video, you can also see Dr. Stephen Thaler. So thanks again for his presentation this evening. He's with I believe it's your own company, Imagination Engines. And we're going to be talking about the non-protoplasmic sentience driving DABUS. So a little bit about what we're talking about here is 30 years ago, Imagination Engines patented the notion of artificial neural nets engaged in a noise-driven brainstorming session. Although this AI paradigm produced significant results with narrow areas such as personal hygiene products, materials discovery, entertainment, and creative robots, it still lacked the ability to produce discoveries that span multiple knowledge domains. And a little bio about Dr. Thaler. He earned his PhD in physics from the University of Missouri-Columbia, where he developed an interest in modeling crystal lattices using artificial neural nets. From there, he worked at aerospace giant McDonnell Douglas, working diverse areas that included radiation hardening, low observable technology, and the use of high energy lasers and the growth of exotic materials. Inspired by earlier research into hallucination with artificial neural nets, he formed his own company based upon the foundational generative neural network architecture that became known as the creativity machine and later device for the autonomous bootstrapping of unified sentience. Kind of a mouthful, but I got through it. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Dr. Thaler for his presentation. Also wanted to mention, we do have questions. If you want to go ahead and put it in the chat, we'll do our best to address it if we have time during the hour.
Thank you, Carrie, and congratulations on the pronunciations. They were excellent.
I had to practice.
I'd like to thank all of you for the gracious invitation to speak tonight. I know that there were a few debates about the title of this talk, the non-protoplasmic sentience driving DABUS, but I think it really makes the point that I'm striving toward in the course of this talk. So there might have been some reluctance because of all of the claims lately that I don't agree with, that some large language models were in fact sentient. So, but I think what I'm about to talk about is sentient, and I will make the appropriate case. A bit of a note beforehand, DABUS, contrary to what the press is stating, is not really just an algorithm. It is a whole system, collection of different computer components, electro-optical components. Each of these subsystems, of course, governed by their own particular algorithms. So it's like the brain, subsystems and algorithms at work in each one of those. And DABUS, of course, is called, it's short for Device for the Autonomous Bootstrapping of Unified Sentience. And I emphasize that the S in DABUS stands for sentience. And of course, I can get done with very long talks and people will say, well, I don't know what sentience is. Well, I think that a dictionary reading is very helpful. You know, the standard operating procedure is to go to Merriam-Webster, and here's what they list. Number one, a sentient quality or state. That doesn't do as much good. It's a little bit circular. But two, I think, does ring a bell, a feeling or sensation, as distinguished from a perception or thought. So what that says is a feeling or a sensation is just something that just happens spontaneously, autonomously. It takes no reasoning, it takes no contemplation, it takes no deliberation. It just occurs. And included in that group would be emotion, but we'll be talking about that a little bit later in this talk. And I got a kick out of the example sentence that Webster offered. In essence, people are assigning human-like sentience to today's AI, despite the undeniable and inarguable fact that no such AI exists as yet. So I guess I'm here to deny and to argue to the contrary. So let me add, before going into this talk, there's a lot of material to unpack to fully explain what DABUS is about and how it works. So I'll do my best. So this is a very high level talk. I guess there's a Q&A period later on. You can ask more specific questions, but of course I can't go into detail, this being a privately owned company, to talk about some of the proprietary details, but there are, trust me. So launching into this talk, let's go back in time to the very beginning of DABUS. In the brain, as I learned back in the 70s, there are basically two ways that neurons communicate. They can essentially perform what's known as synaptic transmission, in which an electrical wave comes down the axon of one neuron, triggers the release of neurotransmitters across the gap, the synaptic cleft, if you will, and some of those neurotransmitter molecules are captured within receptor sites on the receiving neuron. And once they are received, they launch a polarization wave too in the second neuron, and so forth and so on. Now that's probably 99% of what artificial neural networks are emulating. The point I was making, in the brain, there are two forms of communication between neurons: synaptic transmission. Neurotransmitters are launched across the synaptic cleft, go a small distance, are claimed by receptor sites, and they in turn launch a polarization wave. And that's probably 99% of what artificial neural networks emulate. But what's left out of the picture is what's known as volume transmission, in which certain neurons, colonies of neurons, specialize at the wholesale release of neurotransmitter molecules. And they essentially diffuse through the open synaptic clefts of biological neural networks. And guess what? When they encounter receptors, they bind with them and they launch a polarization wave. Now think about it for a minute. There doesn't have to be any kind of stimulus coming in from the left. You know, if the system is not perceiving anything, it's not thinking anything. In fact, everything is pretty much nulled out at the first neuron. But simply because we have this noise in the form of neurotransmitter molecules being captured by receptors, it can launch a polarization wave as if something is happening at the inputs of this system. And I started writing about that, publishing it as the virtual input effect. It's a phantom input to the system. And at first I explained hallucination based on that, as well as probably traumatic brain experience and all sorts of virtual experiences. But I was thinking beyond that, simply that this phantom input effect is the basis of cognition, consciousness, and sentience, as you're about to see. But I took such an interest in that phenomenon that I started taking artificial neural networks and essentially training them so that they absorbed a collection of memories. And I shut off the inputs by pinning them at constant values. So effectively, the neural network is blindfolded. And what I did was steadily increase the level of injected perturbations into the network. It could be these red dots you see up here in this box representing a neural network. And as I did ramp up the synaptic perturbation level, I actually kept track of the number of patterns being delivered per unit time. In other words, the number of notions coming off this net because of the internal noise. It's rather interesting. You start off, of course, at zero perturbation. There are no disturbances to drive the turnover of the net, but then you start to increase and you start sporadically seeing outputs from the net, virtual inputs essentially. And then it speeds up and the output becomes more linear in its rhythm, and then suddenly doubles over and falls back towards zero. That is because when you reach this apex, the network can no longer perform accurate pattern completion. In other words, it can't reconstruct its memories. So what it starts doing is generating one-off and two-off variations on the memories it's absorbed. In other words, they are plausible. So we don't need another network, for instance, that is assessing whether or not the output pattern from this net is reminiscent of the training exemplars. It simply is automatically by virtue of tuning it into this V regime, as I call it. And of course, as you continue to wrap up the internal perturbation, the network tends to generate generic patterns, oftentimes nonsense, plateaus off, then begins falling off again until there's so much noise in the system that all the neurons are pinned, and the whole network cannot really produce a turnover of patterns. Sort of, I call it the deer in the headlights regime. It's as though the whole neural network is flooded with the equivalent of cortical adrenaline, and it can't think of anything else. So because of this Goldilocks zone, I was inspired to actually attach another network to the generator net. And this happened in the 70s, believe it or not. But essentially, the lower net that I called an alert associative center watching an imagination engine, as I called it, could then generate reinforcement learning within the imagination engine. So what happened over time is this network would become an associative memory for the very best of its ideas, because this network is basically acting as a filter that essentially looks for novelty and utility in these output patterns. So it gets a little bit more interesting if we make these networks constantly adapting, constantly training. And what we see essentially is a two-way tug of war between the two nets, in which we see an elevation in internal noise, in which case subliminal idea creation is achieved. Subliminal because you're so flooded with perturbations in the lower net, it's not really aware, it's not lucid, until, of course, it falls back into the U regime, as I call it, and now the lower net can become aware of what's going on. So there were problems with this whole scheme. First of all, the output of that upper net is a layer of neurons, an output layer, and they essentially are an on-off pattern of neurons, thinking rather tongue-in-cheek, simply, and the network down here interprets those patterns. So that's the language that develops spontaneously between these two nets. The problem with this whole scheme, if you want to scale it to the dimensions of the human brain, it gets very unwieldy. You have too many connections, essentially with the connections squaring as the number of inputs. So if you have 10 to the 11 neurons, you're going to have 10 of the 22 connections. It's just totally impractical to train a network like that. Too many training exemplars and so forth and so on, not good enough hardware. And of course, the critic down here has to be proportional in size to the generator net. Totally impractical. Plus, what you have going on here is not really what I would call creativity at its utmost. Essentially, it is an optimization process going on to find global optimal solutions, but it's not really combining conceptual spaces to create whole new ideas. So that was one of the inspirations, the shortcomings of the creativity machine. And here's an example. One classic experiment, which is highly publicized, was the invention of a crazy looking toothbrush with the crossed bristles. And the exercise was essentially collect data on the different example brushes, the parameters being things like bristle length, the colonies, the distributions, the stiffnesses, inclinations of bristles, and so forth. And then we introduced the noise to create the one-off and two-off variations. Among them was the cross bristle design. And we trained another network to map from these different design parameters to different performance parameters, such as the area removal from teeth, the depth of penetration, and so forth. But that, in my honest opinion, is not invention. Invention involves the combination of concepts, juxtapositional inventions. So go back in time many centuries to Tang Dynasty, China, according to Wikipedia, and somebody got the bright idea of pushing hog whiskers into bamboo sticks. So it's a juxtaposition essentially of these three notions. Of course, I'm simplifying quite a bit, but essentially we're combining simple concepts to create some advantageous outcome, namely oral hygiene. And of course, if you want after that, you can perform parametric optimization, as has happened naturally over the years as materials were optimized and geometries were improved quite a bit. So we have now the modern toothbrush. Well, that was one motivation, essentially to go from parametric optimization to conceptualization in artificial neural networks. And here was another motivation, the biological motivation. Here is a functional brain scan, and you certainly cannot see individual neurons. Anyone see them? I can't see them. So what you do see, however, are filaments or ribbons forming within cortex. And that's all the result, of course, pattern exchange. So patterns are working beneath the hood, but they're working together to form these filaments and ribbons. So why not use that as the representation of the brain that other parts can look at and classify? And the claim is, from neurobiologists that the thalamus, which is approximately here where the diagram is pointing, lights up. In other words, it resonates when something of salience is materializing up in cortex, an idea. I don't know how they arrive at that decision. Maybe it's just pure correlation between ideas being thought and the thalamus lighting up. But we do know from Francis Crick of DNA fame that thalamus essentially acts as an attentional spotlight. And it's not because it's shining photons on cortex, it's because it's amplifying certain circuits and de-amplifying others to emphasize things that are of interest to the brain in general. So salience somehow is determined in thalamus. Nobody explained that. And then I might say that understanding how salience is determined in the thalamic reticular nucleus, the thin membrane surrounding thalamus, is the key to a brain simulation, because the simulation can decide what's important and what isn't. So that was yet another motivation. So the indications are that we need to build these brain simulations at a slightly coarser level of granularity than just neurons and connection weights. And what I did was build associative memories. I don't know if you're all aware of what neural network implemented associative memory is, but essentially it's an auto-associative network that learns how to replicate a specific set of input patterns at the output end, and it stores them. So now later, if we apply an input and it's stored in the net, it should be reproduced at the output. So you can do tricks like recirculate the output back to the input again, essentially generate a whole memory if in fact the input is fragmentary or somehow degraded. So it's content addressable. Meaning we can give it imperfect information and get the corresponding information out. So in my jargon, I say resonant when the input is about equal to the output. The net produces a scalar metric delta, which is the Euclidean distance between the input and output. And a delta approaching zero, the reconstruction error, implies a matching memory has been found. And you can think of that as a compact database that is content addressable. So now we're ready to start discussion of DABUS. DABUS begins life as a large array of these associative memories. And in training sessions, we essentially read it information, talk to it, show it pictures, show it all sorts of media. And it might turn out that one of these nets corresponds to dogs, So it contains a conceptual space of all the different dog breeds, images thereof. You might have another net that contains all of the um, acoustic wave patterns for a dog barking. So they're stored in the net too, and they're addressable. So when we introduce some combination of things to the system, such as a dog entering the room and barking, of course, one net is going to recognize the dogs, and the other is going to recognize the waveform for barking. And because of their co-resonance, they will bind together. And those of you in the field recognize that as Hebbian learning. But Hebbian learning is usually discussed in the context of neurons binding together. These are whole neural networks binding together because of the covariance going on. So this tends to go on, and we build up longer and longer co-resonant chains, as you'll see in a moment. And noise plays a big role too, because noise can fool those two neurons. For instance, if we introduce some excitatory noise between A and B can think, well, A is resonating when it really isn't. And A can think, well, B is resonating, but it's not really. It's because of the noise, and they'll bind together. Likewise, if you introduce some negative or inhibitory disturbance to the connection between A and B, you can actually break the A and B combination apart. So you have make or break mechanisms for building up long chains within the DABUS system, sort of like those filaments and ribbons that you saw in cortex. So what happens over time, and of course I don't have the time to talk about the mechanisms in detail, but what happens is we start seeing the buildup of complex concepts. It could be A, B, C, and D. A could be wheel, B could be axle, C could be box, D could be internal combustion engine. But we also recognize, because we see C and D resulting in some consequence, that it's naturally going to yield the same consequences. So this could be the car, if you will. E, F, and G could be proceed to grocery store, E, F, and G. But then we encounter what I call a hot button. And a hot button is something that has impact to the system as a whole. And human being, it's something existential, such as getting nutrition and surviving. And parenthetically, we're all supplied with these hot buttons at birth. They're factory installed. Or I should say Darwin has put them in place, because you need to have these responses. Things like the Moro response. Anyone ever hear of that in infants, that they sense they're falling, so they have a fear of falling. So as a result, and I'll show you more of the mechanism for this, how it happens. This hot button can trigger the release of neurotransmitters, or the simulation thereof, in the form of perturbations. And so the perturbations can essentially reinforce what's here in the chain. So we get a memory complete with the base concept, along with the consequences and the accompanying hot button. And then later on, we can reuse some of those consequence chains, go to grocery store and buy some nutrition and the hot button, but now it's a Jetson flying car. So not only do you have the advantage here of this consequence chain, but you've got the consequence here of the jet engine that can move you faster too at the grocery store. So the double advantage is reinforced even more, all due to the variation in the simulated neurotransmitter level. So what you wind up with is a 1,000-ring circus. Many memories forming up, latent idea that could be the product of nothing more than transient noise in the system. You have old ideas that are formed up, the base idea, plus a consequence chain and a hot button. And then you have new ideas that are forming up, complete with their consequence chains. And if you're setting DABUS to work, inventing or discovering, you want to know what the new ideas are as opposed to the old ones, right? So the way we do that is by essentially using a zoom filter. There really aren't zoom filters. I was building these way back in the late 90s and early 2000s, but essentially the whole picture, the whole neural landscape is passed through a big autoassociative net that is constantly training. And what that does essentially is screen out those past chains which were not that novel. And it tends to emphasize those that are new on the scene. So you basically have your backdrop, you come into it, you show up as an anomaly. Well, the new ideas show up as anomalies, but more than that, they're anomalies compared to a long history of exposures to the system. Plus, because some of these concepts are activating or resonating in series, the older ones tend to be less emphasized because they're not novel anymore, whereas the new ones tend to be emphasized. So you actually see the ordinality of the chain. And certainly if A, B, and C happen, that's a lot different than C, A, and B happening. So that is actually encoded in the chains in addition. So then there's an extra layer here, and I actually call this a thalamobot in celebration of the thalamus and TRN in the brain, but it's a foveator. It essentially is looking around the scene. Here's the extracted idea, and essentially the eyeball here represents an attention window moving around, or even a camera panning, tilting, and zooming in on the scene, and it's looking for, in particular, these hot buttons. If the hot buttons are discovered, or even the trajectory leading up to them, that can trigger the release of neurotransmitters, or the simulation thereof, that now reinforce the whole idea and its consequences. Now, let me emphasize that in humans, probably the mammalian brain, those hot buttons are existential consequences. But if you are a computer scientist, you would want to make those practical, successful outcomes. You can play God, if you will, or Darwin, and essentially plant them in the system. But by doing that, you are not necessarily directing the system to achieve that. Essentially, it's a long associative chain. You never know when they're going to be encountered, and usually it's a mystery as to why they do actually connect. But the interesting concept here, I don't know if you can see the title here, but this is a what I call a topological thought molecule. Now, these things are not connected geometrically. They might be light years apart, but topologically, they are connected, like the old joke of a donut becoming a coffee pot with enough deformation. But essentially, what you wind up with is a chain of concepts making up a larger concept. So you might have concepts A through Z. And what happens is, over time, is these consequence chains grow from them. Some are not yet complete. They're forming, they're growing like plants over time. Some are associative dead ends. They circle back on themselves and re-enter the base thought. And also, some of these will encounter hot buttons. They'll release the perturbations that effectively either destroy or reinforce one of these idea chains. And also, you can have idea chains that hit hot buttons that can now release the opposite sign of perturbation. In other words, inhibitory perturbations. And sometimes they can titrate against each other. You can have positive against negative, and essentially it's the equivalent of an idea that both has strengths and weaknesses, and you're sort of left puzzled to whether or not it's a good idea or not. But it looks very much like molecule formation, and you have functional groups. Let me also point out that in fields like deep learning, the nets usually terminate in multi-layer perceptrons, and classification goes on to a closed set of categories. So, one output node might correspond to cats, another one to dogs, another one's to pagodas, another one to monsters, whatever. But essentially, the world consists of many more than those few different categories. This is the perfect way of classifying things in terms of their functional outcome. And it almost looks like pigeon language, the thing that runs across the plains on iron rails and spews smoke. That is basically something you can identify as a train, for instance. And then you can add another layer that incorporates the cultural name for that thing. But essentially, we are forming functional definitions. And this is either a perception or it is a thought forming up. I call that whole process reification because it's making something rather abstract more concrete by stipulating what the outcomes are of it. Let me also say that there's quite a bit of a compression going on here. It's unifying different models. So you have chaining models 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 3 out to NN, if you will. And what we do is integrate all these pictures together into a unified model using optical techniques. It should be no secret after seeing that cover slide that I'm using cameras to do this. And it's a sparse representation. And essentially the chain formation takes longer than the transfer and to a critic. And it turns out that the camera, the visual system, is a much faster way of doing things and a way to integrate and extend this easily to 100 billion neurons, which is essentially the goal to duplicate a brain. So we get a unified model, and that's where the U comes into DABUS, unified sentience, because we're developing a feeling for it out here on the right. So compression is our friend here. Whole conceptual spaces, for instance, are being compressed into associative memories, the GMFs, as I call them. Concepts and strategies are represented as shapes formed by linked associative memories. It's no longer bits and bytes. I mean, you cannot, properly encode 2 to the million power different states of a system if we're looking at bits in a typical display. And there's an analog geometric compression going on due to the camera and the novelty filter. And then finally, there is a JPEG compression going on so that we can farm out the image, the condensation of all this activity to other machines that are watching. And furthermore, there is streamlining, if not compression, because we're not looking for critical chains. We're looking eventually for the hot buttons that are activated. If a hot button activates, then it will essentially secrete the appropriate neurotransmitter simulation. So this is sort of a crucial slide because it's basically the title of the talk, the non-protoplasmic consciousness and sentience. And essentially the creativity machines were a crude simulation of consciousness because the noise produced a turnover of different pattern-based ideas. And that's exactly what happens to us. We may have no inputs from the environment, but we relax and essentially we observe a stream of ideas flowing through our heads. And that, I claim, is because of noise. I've got a lot of papers along those lines, but essentially the whole stream of consciousness has the same fractal distribution as human stream of consciousness. There is then a non-contemplative pattern propagation through the consequent side chains to activate hot buttons. So for instance, here we are in our car, we're looking out and some truck has just crossed the double yellow line, is headed toward us. And in our imaginations, we see the truck getting bigger and bigger and bigger, a lot of honking, a lot of broken glass, and bam, possible death or injury. And essentially that secretes things like cortical adrenaline. And that tends to traumatically reinforce the chain. And then ultimately, because Hebbian learning is going on through this associative chain, the hot button becomes automatically associated with the concept chain down here. So we achieve that non-contemplative reaction that could amount to something like a psychological hangup, a psychopathology, or it could just be a sharp instinct for what's about to happen. But this is a feeling. The chain of memories combined with just the diffusing disturbances throughout the brain to create a range of different feelings. And it's all because of this Hebbian learning process. And that volume release infiltrates all the cortical areas, resulting in spontaneous feeling sensations via the virtual input effect I talked about in the very first slide. And the result of all this shows that consciousness, sentience, and cognition are all combined together to do what they do. But essentially, it is that sentience that is driving the idea formation. So, and it's all done with non-protoplasmic parts. So it may turn out that sentience and consciousness are not limited to the protoplasmic stuff, the stinky stuff, if you will. So ideation amounts to not generating patterns, but essentially these chains. So here's actually a summary of what happened with the formation of the well-known fractal container. So what happens over time is we start seeing a pooling together of binary concepts, things like a fractal container. Of course, there's no real significance to that other than, well, it showed up together in coincidence. But we see trinary combinations, more surface area and so forth. And then we see a transition to another colony of filters, allows faster cooling, brings pleasure. And the pleasure, of course, is a hot button. And that reinforces the entire topology and is bound to return again with the return of noise in the system. And I think this is the key to building sentient artificial general intelligence, especially if we avoid all the InfiniBand and the high-speed serial transfers. We can now produce 100 trillion neuron simulations, brain simulations, and it's just a matter of money at this point and resources and talent to do just that. And again, we return to this original slide. This is the origin of all the feelings that are hard to imagine. Realizing that cortex is basically all the sensory channels. So if we throw a noise into it, it's not really particular about which cortex it's in. It can be visual cortex, in which case it tends to generate hallucinatory experience. If it's an auditory cortex, it generates auditory illusions, voices. It could be orchestras playing, tense music, whatever. It could be in motor areas, where you tend to feel texture, things like that, and pain. It could be, literally the pain in the butt, if you will, or at least the hallucination of it. So these are all of the feelings that accompany sentience, and they're not all true. But then again, brains are not perfect. So you might be interested. Here's an example of a 10,000 network array that is imagining new art. And you can see what good the novelty filter does. Unfortunately, you can't really see the activity here. Maybe, I don't know if the connection is good enough to see that, but there's change going on here. But here's what you observe when you look at the scene through the novelty filter. You see a topologically encoded idea. and the brightness of those spots actually encode the order with which they were thought by the system. Here's an example. This is getting rather infamous at this point. It's the artwork entitled "A Recent Entrance to Paradise" that's being contested of all the copyright offices around the world right now. There was no text to image. What we're looking at is the ongoing contemplation of this brain, which has learned as much as it could about its environment. And now it's imagining a lot of different kinds of scenes. So, I mean, the text to image is something I was doing long ago, but this interested me much more, essentially a brain that's making up its own experience. The hot button is another image here. It's a zone plate, if you understand what that is. That is essentially the, I guess, the basic alphabet of holography. But what I've done is implant that as a, how should I say, a very important memory within the system. And if the whole chain intercepts the zone plate image, then the whole thing is reinforced. So cleverly, the whole thing's integrated together. It's not just a mosaic of different images. It's essentially a coherent combination of images. And actually, the rippling essentially is the remnants of the zone plate in the image. But note that it's generalizing. There was no such thing as 3 tracks side by side. The system had never seen an office space built into a hillside like this, integrated with the tunnel to paradise. So what it's doing is, building up a jigsaw puzzle, and if a piece doesn't quite fit, it basically modifies it through noise to actually fit. It's like biting off pieces of the jigsaw puzzle to fit the overall design. Here's a recent application of it, fully funded right now, but this is basically a financial application, watching the markets, and essentially is classifying all these trajectories. Rather than neuron activations. Music, actually, the first CD of totally self-conceived AI music was Song of the Neurons in 2006. The first batch of fantasy images like Recent Entrance to Paradise were created back in 2012, just now fighting for their IP rights. And then Invention, essentially 2018, lawyers came to me and said, "Can you invent something new?" And I said, "Well, I do have a system. It's not meant to be an invention machine. It is, in fact, a laboratory for studying machine consciousness and machine sentience." So put it to work, and it contemplated on its own for a few days on end, and came up with the fractal container, as well as the neural flame. Stock market modeling, well-funded between 2021 and 22. We're working on medical applications, a little bit hush-hush right now, but we're also starting to get indications that investors are interested in the AGI aspect of DABUS. So there's Recent Entrance to Paradise. There's a fractal container. I do have pictures of the real thing. In fact, here it is. If you're curious, there's a fractal container. And even at this stage, it has about 3 times the area of an equivalent volume in a cylindrical soup can, for instance. But because of the enhanced surface area, 3 times at this stage, it has faster heat transfer and is more grabbable by human hands or robotic handlers. And if you're curious, here are a few articles you might want to look at. I don't know if you can do a screen capture, but essentially, overview of the creativity machine was published in 2013. And essentially the kickoff article for the DABUS system was in 2019. It was published actually in 2021. but that the whole system of generating not activation patterns of neurons, but chains of neural networks was called vast topological learning and sentient AGI. So with that, DABUS thanks you. I thank you. I give my voice a little bit of a rest, but I welcome questions. Thank you.
Okay, we've got some questions here. We're going to start out with are the hot button areas injected into the model, or how do they arise?
Well, we can either teach it some traumatic experience, or we can artificially introduce it. Certainly in DABUS, it has not had to survive evolutionary pressures. So essentially they are generated artificially.
Yeah,
Alvin.
yeah. So I have a question, Dr. Thaler. So when I first of all, heard about what you just mentioned about with imagination engine and also with artificial neural networks, one of the things that came to my mind, I wanted to ask you about that. How does this differ from neuromorphic computing, right? Because the thing is about neuromorphic computing, you have like now, like for example, Intel and a lot of other companies, or so even academic institutions are creating chips that go ahead and uses synapses, right? So if you're familiar with like how the brain works, it's kind of a little bit similar to artificial neural networks, but not, because the thing is that it's actually using a spiking neural network, where you have a particular neuron that spikes and has and activates it and connects to another particular one. So I'm just wanting to see how does your work or so relate to, differs, or is similar to neuromorphic computing, if that makes sense.
Well, I can use spiking neurons, any kind of neuron you can suggest, but the whole concept depends upon the formation of whole neural networks and not neurons that are binding themselves together. So it's the neural network. So if you had a bunch of neuromorphic chips, each one being a neural network, and they joined together to represent complex ideas, I think then you would be implementing a DABUS system. And essentially you're looking at the trajectories taken by activations or resonances of these networks, as opposed to the activation patterns of individual neurons. So we're able to reach hundreds of trillions of neurons in these systems using very simple-minded systems like flat panel displays and 60 hertz cameras, or we get more sophisticated and use optical neural networks as the visual or the optical source, and faster and faster cameras. So I don't see the similarity with neuromorphic chips. I mean, yeah, you can make each network a deep net, you can make it an LSTM, whatever, but it's the whole combination of neural networks.
Okay, so basically, I guess what in summary is that your particular DABUS or DABUS architecture or so is independent of the type of whether it is artificial neural network or whether it's spiking neural network. It doesn't matter what it is. You just have a framework that you can go ahead and be able to stitch the pieces together.
Correct.
Okay, great. Thank you.
This is a two-part question. How would DABUS work if integrated in a robot? Which the questioner notes this is slightly an open-ended question. And but would it work like an infant baby learning to grasp things and learning language, etc.?
Well, we've actually done that with the Air Force with the AFRL way back, probably 15 years ago. But for some reason, we couldn't get funding beyond phase 2. So I'd love to be involved in that kind of thing. But and keep in mind, too, that this particular AI patent is the optical version of it, but we've got many others in prosecution right now that would involve simply electronic transfer between neural networks, basically processors that are operating their own neural networks. But yeah, that is a tempting area to get into. Trouble is, I'm inundated. I drown in the technology. There are too many applications and too many papers to be written, too many patents to be patented. So
I just when you mentioned music of the neurons, I did a search, and you can tell me if this is too old of an article, but I found this in the Chicago Tribune from 2007, and anyone
who's it written by?
John Van.
Oh yeah, good friend of mine.
Anyone who has used a computer probably has experienced the urge to torture it, maybe even kill it. And says that you have tortured and nearly killed his computers, meaning you. Believing it makes their thinking more creative. Skipping some steps here. After they've learned to do something like compose music, Thaler tortures the computers with the machine equivalent of a near-death experience. What is he referring to?
I think that he's referring to my initial forays into perturbations within neural networks around the 92, 93 timeframe. Actually, before that, late 80s. I was actually training neural networks and simulating cell apoptosis in them, in other words, neuron death. And what I observed were coherent ideas coming off of it. When that happened. I mean, the famous quote is, after absorbing different Christmas carols, the lyrics, it came up with, in the end, all men go to good earth in one eternal silent night. So that was essentially the first nothing to text statement of the dying network. And essentially I was getting music out of it, near-death music. So he was impressed. But you see, that was something that attracted the press to talk about imagination engines. But behind the scenes, I wasn't really thinking about near-death experiences. Just too controversial. Did not buy me friends at the time. But that's all it takes, basically, is internal damage in a net. The network interprets the internal damage as something meaningful and outputs something meaningful up to a limit. So I think that's what he's referring to. I think he was a little bit confused because I wasn't killing the networks that were generating music at this point. I was simply upping the serotonin or cortical adrenaline simulations to achieve the music, and I was using a camera to evaluate the emotion of my face as candidate music was played. So, yeah, the initial experiments were with near-death experience. Now take that back again. Probably the first experiments were back in the 70s when I would take Ising models, which were essentially some of the first artificial neural networks, and freeze in the memory of smiley faces. And I would then start snipping connections or throwing in perturbations to the net, and it would draw derivative faces. And some of them were quite clever. And I would build another algorithm that would judge the symmetry and the content. Does it have eyes? Does it have a nose? Does it have a mouth? And so forth. Soon to be replaced by a neural network that did that. But essentially, that was work that was done in my hobby time back in the 70s. And that led eventually to the creativity machine and to DABUS.
Well, looks like we have one last question here. And this one sounds like this person wants to start getting started with his own version. How much processing is required to answer a query lookup classification in this approach? ChatGPT seems to require billions or trillions of calculations per query because of the model size.
Are we talking about artificial neural networks, like a deep net?
Not sure from here, just is wondering how much processing do you need to do what you're doing? Perhaps that's the question.
Impressively small amounts of resources. And currently, I've got systems that are involving 4 processors, heavily multi-threaded, and the chain formation, is taking place rather readily, a millisecond or so. And of course, the transfer, of course, is limited by the, I guess, the video rate, the frame rate of the camera. But 60 hertz is plenty fast, 10 milliseconds or so to process, no big deal. So if you are willing to wait 10 milliseconds for a great idea, there's no problem. So again, the chain modeling approach was done to speed things up quite a bit. The speed and the I'm getting a chat here. Somebody's saying that chatbot is not neuromorphic. I can believe that.
Yeah, so maybe another question that I have also too is that, you mentioned about in terms of the person asked about processing. What about in terms of power consumption, right? Because we know that, large language models are so, one of the things that the criticisms are so, or limitations, with current, deep neural networks or so is that, it takes a lot of power, right? So if you're running a, training a lot of stuff, like a large language model, you need a lot of, power to run this. And one of the things with neuromorphic computing or so, an example of that is that, it runs like very, very little power to do those type of, operations. What about the power consumption in the case of for DABUS?
Well, which version of DABUS? You saw basically a financial application that was running on 4 different Dell computers, I think 48 processors each. And I don't know, I haven't been keeping track of power consumption. All I want to do is achieve an end. So you'll have to wait for that answer as to the power consumption.
Okay. That's still a work in progress, right? Or that's like one of the
yeah. A lot of this stuff is basically proof of principle exercises. And I've got my hands full just running those principle experiments.
So thank you, Dr. Thaler. That was great. Very interesting. We're always looking for upcoming speakers. So if you are interested or have a colleague that has a topic that they'd like to share with us, there's a few ways you can get a hold of us. Feel free to put some information in the chat window, how we can get a hold of you, email address. Also, check us out on Twitter. I'm sort of the voice of the ACM local Twitter account at this time. Otherwise, you can communicate with us through the meetup groups. Both the ACM Chicago and ACM DC chapters have meetup groups that you can communicate with as well. And then Mark and Alvin have been having several meetings in recent months as well. So you can also feel free to reach out to them if you're from one of the Chicago groups, either the ACM or the IEEE. Great. I think that concludes our meeting.
Yeah. And then maybe just one more last thing before we go is that this meeting was recorded. And so we will send the copy of the recording, which will also be on the ACM Chicago and local YouTube channels. And you'll get a copy of the slides as well. And if you need a professional development hour, I know a lot of people here, are going for professional engineering certification or so. If you need a PDH hour as well, we can also provide that certificate to you.
And there should also be a survey too when I end the session. So keep an eye out for that.
Okay, great.
All right.
I am looking for collaborators and potential employees. So
there you go.
Keep an eye out for me, please.
So if you're interested in wanting to work with Dr. Thaler, go ahead and contact him. If you need a job,
Sounds like a cool gag.
Well, thanks. Great talk.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Thaler. Thank you, Terry, for organizing. Great. Thank you, Mark.
Hope it made sense.
It did. Thank you very much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Yep. Bye.
Have a good evening.
Bye.